So what we're going to do, I'm going to give you about a 10-minute Energy Balance 101 to set the framework for this, and then John will take over from there. Now, how many of you have ever asked this question, is a calorie a calorie? I see that out there all the time. It drives me crazy. Is a calorie a calorie? So I want to sort of give you the perspective from, remember, we've talked about energy balance. So what would that mean from an energy balance point of view? And again, here's the system we're using. So the question is a calorie when it passes through the body? Okay? On one hand, yeah.
Now it seems like the question, and it's probably directly relatable to this, has recently been, is a carb a carb?
Exactly. Same way. So let's look at, is a calorie from different sources? Carb, protein, fat. We'll forget alcohol for a minute. But the question is a calorie a calorie? Well, on one hand, of course it is. It's a unit of energy. And energy balance is the laws of thermodynamics applied to the body. But when a calorie goes in here, this is the interesting part, is what happens out here. And the analogy is, you could say, is a gallon of gasoline a gallon of gasoline? Well, if you put it in a Volkswagen versus a Ferrari, you're going to get a whole different response. In fact, you probably get 100 Volkswagens and you put it in, you're going to get some variation among Volkswagens. And the variation is what's around here. So at one level, the simple answer is, of course, a calorie is a calorie. But what happens to that calorie through the body may differ, both depending on where it comes from. So here's how I'm going to complicate things. It depends on where the energy comes from, protein, carb, or fat, and it also depends on the state of energy balance you're in. Okay, now I'll try to explain that real simply. Okay, negative energy balance means you're expending more energy than you take in. And so for this purposes, let's use this example. I put you all on a diet. I give you all 1,200 calories, okay? And I make sure you eat 1,200 calories. So the question is, if those 1,200 calories come from fat, carb, protein, does it make any difference? And when it comes to negative energy balance, the answer is no, absolutely not. Well, that makes sense because you're burning every single calorie that comes in. Your body is using it all for fuel, okay? So when it comes to negative energy balance, a calorie is a calorie. Now the caveat is, these are the conditions under which I absolutely make sure you're eating 1,200 calories. Now if I tell you to eat 1,200 calories on different kinds of diets, you may get a different effect because you may feel fuller on one or the other type of diet. So I'm not getting to that situation. I'm saying, if I know that you put 1,200 calories in and I vary that from protein and carbohydrate and fat, is there any difference for weight? And the answer is no. Those studies have been done where you carefully control calories. So under this situation, any fuel that's coming in is burned. And so a calorie is a calorie under that circumstance. Does that make sense? Push back here if you don't understand.
Basically, if you're using everything, it doesn't make a difference.
If you're using everything, it doesn't make a difference. Okay, it's going to be different if you're in other states of energy balance. Now let's go to the opposite. Now you're in positive energy balance. I'm overfeeding you. Okay, now it depends on where those calories come from. Protein, carb, and fat. And the reason is this. Your body has a hierarchy of oxidizing fuels. Protein essentially, all the protein comes in essentially gets oxidized or used for repair. So let's take protein out for a second. Your body has a preference to use carbohydrate as a fuel, okay? So your preference for carbohydrate, and then the energy need that's left over comes from fat. So what would happen if I took all of you and I knew exactly how many calories you expended? Somehow I magically know that. Now I add on 50% extra calories. And in one condition, all those 50% come from carbohydrate. In the other condition, they all come from fat. So 50% excess on top of a mixed diet, what do you think would happen? Would you store same proportion of fat and carbohydrate? Would it differ?
don't know. The
Uh-huh.
media makes
Well,
it sound like you'd store more carbohydrates, but
Well, we actually did that study years ago. And in fact, here's what happens. When you overfeed fat, you store 95% of the excess. The reason is when you add fat, you don't stimulate fat oxidation. Your body's very good at when fat comes in, it doesn't have to convert it, it goes right to body fat. Very efficient to do that. Now, carbohydrate, you're still storing most of it. You're still storing 80 to 90% of it. But what happens is when you overfeed carbohydrate, you increase carbohydrate oxidation a little bit. And the reason you store energy is you now, some of that fat that you were burning before, you don't burn. And it's not stored as efficient. Okay. Let me emphasize, in both conditions, most of what you take as excess ends up stored as body fat. It's just a little bit different, a little bit more stored as fat than carbohydrate. That may be surprising to you because right now all the emphasis is on carbohydrate. Now, this study hasn't been done with complex carbohydrates versus sugar. So it would be fair to do that study, at least to my knowledge it hadn't been done. Do you know, Brett? No. So you might say, well, if you take that 80 to 90% and you looked at complex carbs versus sugar, you might actually find more stored from sugar. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know that it wouldn't happen. But what I do know is it's the fat, excess fat, that's stored very efficiently. And keep in mind, when sugar intake started going up, it was on top of an already high-fat diet. I mean, we eat as a population a very high-fat diet. Now, when you take a high-fat diet and you add on sugar, in many ways, that's sort of the worst possible condition for storing fat. You've already got a high-fat diet, now you add sugar on top of that, you're really going to store a lot of excess energy. So in this situation, the amount of body fat you store does depend on where the calories come from. A calorie is still a calorie, but I can tell you exactly why that should be the case because of what happens to fat and carbohydrate through the body. There's no mystery here. Calories not, different calories have different effects. Now the harder one is this, at weight stability. What happens, again, I know magically how many calories you consume, so now I start switching your composition without changing your calories. That's a little bit differently. And from an expenditure point of view, the calories shouldn't make that much difference. Where I think you get the biggest effect here is the calories on food intake. And again, we did a study a few years ago where we gave people ad libitum access to different amounts of fat. So we gave people a buffet, and we had it set up so you could choose whatever you want, but in one you were going to have lower fat, medium fat, and high fat. And we just looked at how many calories people ate. And again, the higher the fat, the more calories they ate. Now, we haven't done this study with sugar versus carbohydrate, but I'm pointing out the difference between fat and carbohydrate. We also did a meta-analysis of studies that when you take people ad libitum and you lower their fat, they lose a little bit of weight, only a couple of 3 or 4 pounds, and then they stabilize at a new weight. So keep in mind from an energy balance point of view, whether or not a calorie from fat acts in the same way as a calorie from carbohydrate depends on the overall state of energy balance. So does that make sense? And what we need to do are some of those studies. I think it's fair to come back and do these studies, sugar versus other carbohydrates. But the question is there something special about sugar? And there's been some really nice accumulation of the data lately to show this. This is a meta-analysis. You know, a meta-analysis is a summary of studies. And this is one that just came out not very long ago in the British Medical Journal. And what they did is they looked at studies in which sugar was added to your diet, okay? Positive energy balance, right, from sugar. And what they showed pretty clearly is when sugars are added to the diet, weights are higher, okay, which is what we found. Now, you know, this is with sugar and not fat. We would say you'd find the same thing with fat. But it's very clear that when you add sugar on top of a maintenance diet, you get an increase in body weight. But the other interesting question would be, What if you don't have excess energy intake? You simply increase sugar and reduce other kinds of carbohydrate. And they did that. And what you find is exactly zero effect on body weight when you substitute. So what this says is, yes, if you take in extra sugar, you're going to gain body weight. So extra sugar is absolutely associated with higher body weight. But if you were to do the same thing on fat, you would show that extra fat is associated too. So sugar can have an effect on weight, but the effect seems to be through calories. There's nothing magic about just giving sugar if you aren't increasing overall energy intake. I'm not up here saying that doesn't mean sugar isn't bad. It does, but it simply means the reason it's bad is because of the calories it brings, not that there's anything magical about sugar. And they also did this work showing the relationship between sugar intake and blood pressure, triglycerides, all that, exactly the same effect. When it was added to the diet, you saw a negative impact on all those things. When it was substituted for other carbohydrates, you didn't see that effect. So it doesn't say that sugar isn't bad. It simply says the reason sugar is bad is because of the calories it brings. Make sense? Now, it still says that reducing sugars could certainly be one way to reduce body weight. And here again, you look at reducing intake of sugars. Well, in fact, you reduce intake and weight does seem to go down. And the same way in kids. So yes, sugar is a reasonable target to reduce body weight, but I would argue that fat reduction is also a way of doing it, and it's really a matter of calorie reduction. That I don't think there's anything magical about sugar. I get sort of upset when I see all the stuff attributed to sugar. I'm not defending sugar because I think we eat way too much sugar, but sugar brings in 4 calories per gram, fat brings in 9 calories per gram. So as we're trying to look at reducing calories, I don't have a problem in focusing on sugar, but I don't think we should be focusing on sugar alone. And that's why we talked about energy density. And energy density is increased by extra fat and extra sugar. And I think those two are targets. But I worry sometimes that we focus on sugar alone. Fat's okay, so we alternate. There was a time when fat's bad, now fat's good, and it'll be bad again. And we rotate through these cycles. In fact, it's both. It's both sugar and fat that I think are targets.
Why does it cycle like that instead of just over?
Well, we only have 3 nutrients, and we got to change things around. And now there's things on saturated fat. We used to say, oh, saturated fat's really bad, and now people are out there saying, no, saturated fat is good.
Yeah.
That's the problem, is that we have to, we do these studies without understanding the complexity of the whole energy balance regulatory system, I think.
Okay.
How does sugar affect insulin? Isn't that a problem sometimes?
But it has to do with, are you having an excess of calories in or not? So yes, if you have an excess of calories, sugar clearly increases an increase in insulin. And a lot of people say, what's that increase in insulin that come back and increase food intake and da-da-da? It's a good theory. We don't have the data all along. We know there's an increase in insulin. The question is that a good or a bad thing? Insulin increases. Some people say it's better to have a slow, gradual increase in insulin. Sometimes, other people say it's okay if it goes up. The question is, what's that insulin related to? Is that insulin response associated with food intake and weight gain? And that's where we don't have a lot of conclusive data. But it seems to be when it's in excess, yes, you have that, and it does seem to be related to intake and weight gain. But if you're just doing it in a substitution area where you aren't increasing total intake, you don't seem to have the negative effects. So it's not just sugar, it's sugar creating a positive energy balance. Once you have positive energy balance, then all those bad things happen. So again, I'm not trying to make it too overly complicated, but when you say, oh, sugar is bad, yeah, it's not good, but it's a little bit more complicated than that, and it's bad if it brings in total calories. And so you look at things like soft drinks. Well, why are soft drinks a particular target? Well, because they bring in sugar and not a lot of other good things. So if you're going to get sugar, and it's okay to have some sugar in your diet, it's probably better to get it in a form where you might actually get some good stuff along with it. So we were talking last night about soft drinks versus juice. Sugar's the same, but at least in juices there are some redeeming positive qualities. And that's the reason why it's difficult to see soft drinks as much more than treats. There's really no reason for them from a nutrition point of view. The reason is probably other things that diet brings besides just nutrition.
What about gummy bear vitamins?
Well, there were people who were talking a few years ago, should we put vitamins in soft drinks? And I thought, that's the worst idea I've ever heard. I hope people don't do that.
Why didn't it happen? Just for
Didn't-
argument's sake.
Didn't 7-Up
I
try
think
something
the
like that?
reason is, I think even the soft
It was
drink
Sprite.
companies
I
thought
can't
that
Backlash.
would be a backlash on top of that.
One of them tried it. It was 7-Up or Sprite.
Well, vitamin water, you look
Yeah,
at things
vitamin
like
water.
vitamin water,
Yeah.
it's very, at least the people that tell me, it's very tough to get
It-
meaningful amounts of vitamin into that. I think it's really a marketing tool more than anything else.
It was 7-Up, and it was cherry
Was it?
antioxidant mixed berry. 7-Up.
Here
But
is, by the way, somebody asked about fructose, and here's a meta-analysis where fructose was put in the place of other kinds of sugar. And again, with a 1-to-1 substitution where you didn't change total calories, you can see there was absolutely no effect of fructose. So these are the data that are out there in terms of meta-analysis for sugar and fructose right now.
About with sugars, what about when you're talking about if you're gonna have sugar, try and get some nutrition out of it? What's your feeling about in fruits?
Yeah.
Where they're saying, okay, well, if grapes have too much sugar,
Yeah.
or bananas have too much sugar,
See.
and then you see all this and you're like.
See, I'm just the opposite. I think if you get sugar from fruits, that's a great way to get sugar. I think the last thing we should do is discourage people from eating fruits. What's the reason we eat sugar? We don't really need it. The reason we eat sugar is because it tastes good. So there again, there's nothing wrong with that, but you don't want to overdo it. So it's this idea of get your sugar from sources that taste good, that are also bringing other nutrients, and don't overdo it. Yeah.
Can I just, before
Sure.
you ask your question, we structured this session to just be a quick half-hour
Yeah.
introduction to
I'm moving on. So
Okay, I
yeah.
just wanted to just.
All right. Last question, and I'm turning it over to John.
Artificial sweeteners have really gotten a bad rap. What's your take on stevia, truvia?
From a weight point of view, I don't think there's any problem with them. We haven't done safety stuff, so the FDA does safety stuff. So I'll defer to the FDA on safety. But from a body weight point of view, I think they do exactly what they were meant to do. They bring the sweet taste without the calories.
But at what
But did they
cost?
stimulate appetite? Because that's what a lot of
The
people are
only
saying.
model, the data that suggests that are twofold. One is there's a rat model where you give them artificial sweeteners, they eat more. These are rats that live in a cage and they only have access to 2 sources of sweeteners in their whole life. I would argue whether or not that's relevant to the human condition. And the other are associational studies that show, boy, here a group of 100 people that don't drink them, here are 100 people that do drink them. The ones that do drink them weigh more. To me, that's reverse causality. It's the people that weigh more that are seeking them. There's no randomized controlled trial that suggests any negative effect on body weight. Yeah.
You'll see an actual study on Wednesday.
Yeah. Sorry.
So we don't have much time left, so I won't take a lot of time. So it's the elephant in the room. So this is my role is to come back to where I was this morning to get you to think. And before we talk about what do I want you to think about, which is really what do you believe and where do those beliefs come from? What do you believe is the cause of obesity? Do you think what you read is it's all about food, that's right, or it's all about physical activity, that's right, or what? And I'll just show you one thing here, which is this notion. Jim talked a lot about energy balance. You can achieve energy balance at any body weight. You can weigh 500 pounds and be in energy balance, just as long as you're not gaining any more weight or losing any weight. You're in energy balance, right? You can be in energy balance at 150 pounds. So the question we have as a nation is, at what level of energy flux should we attempt to achieve energy balance for the population? And I think it's very important, because if we say that we are going to give in and we're never going to be more physically active than we are today, we're basically going to be a sedentary population, then you're going to have to watch everything you put in your mouth for the rest of time. And all the stuff that we talked about, sugar, whatever, it's like you can't eat any of that because there's no activity to do anything with it. And so I think this is a really important question. So do we want to be the sedentary nation, or do we want to be the active nation? And what we're ignoring, I think, when we look at activity is it serves more than burning calories. Look at all the stuff coming out about physical activity and learning, about cognition, about prevention of Alzheimer's disease, prevention of Parkinson's disease. You have all of these things which are improved by movement that we're not putting into the equation when we think about what do we want to be when we grow up. I mean, it'd be great if we could sit around all day and eat all we wanted and no consequence, but we know that's not going to happen. So I really want to go back to the question, which is, what do you all believe? And where do those beliefs come from? And we only have 5 minutes, but is anybody brave enough to say, here's what I believe and this is why I believe it?
Well, I believe in physical activity. And so I cover fitness, or that's like the word that I call it for the most part. But fitness is something that scares a lot of people, on this idea that fitness is something you have to do at a gym, and that's something that only appeals to a small portion of the population. And physical activity, which fitness is a part of, is something that everybody needs, even people who are fit, who are into fitness, maybe do that for an hour a day, still aren't getting that physical activity that they need the rest of the day. So, I mean, I see it everywhere.
Anybody else?
I believe it should be food. And along with, and not just quantity, but quality. Getting away from genetically modified foods, having stricter standards for food labeling, knowing what to look for. I mean, we see labels like natural and raspberry flavor and that mislead us into thinking that what we're consuming is healthy when it's not. I mean, for example, I was just drinking iced tea this morning and just happened to look at the label. Lo and behold, it has high fructose corn syrup in it. I never thought that iced tea would have corn syrup in it, not to mention high fructose. I mean, most corn is genetically modified these days. How does that mess up with our bodies? We don't have enough research to indicate the side effects that go with GMOs.
It's all price. It's all about price. So that's the cheapest way to make corn, and that's what's driving the marketplace. It's the economics of it. So I don't disagree with anything you've said. It's like, yes, there's all kinds of misleading labels out there that make you want to think that I should be eating this. It's got all natural fill in the blank. Well, everything's natural to some extent.
Cocaine is natural.
Right. Yeah, it's like organic. Well, it's got carbon in it, it's organic. So, well, I'm a chemist, so that's like, well, duh. But I think part of what we're struggling with is that underlined or. Why does it have to be or? I mean, so we tend to be, this is back to the old, is it sugar, is it fat, is it this? It's yes. But I think
well, let me give you one example. We study a group of people here with the highest sugar intake we've ever seen. Any idea who they are?
Me.
Elite athletes. Elite athletes are consuming in quantity more sugar than the obese people we study. No metabolic disease. So the concept is, you can't look and say, you're taking this sugar, she may be unhealthy. You look at what's coming out the other side. These guys are expending so much energy, it doesn't matter what they eat. Their body is burning every single calorie that comes in. Now, is that the best for them? My guess is probably not. Probably if they change the composition a little bit, it might be a little bit better. But from a weight point of view, if you're burning this stuff off, and athletes are also burning a lot of fat, so they're eating a high-fat, high-sugar diet because they have to get enough calories in. So looking at one side of it makes no sense unless you look at the other side of it.
And the last thing I'll leave you with is really a question. So I think the idea that we should make food into tobacco as a way to take on the problem is gaining some traction. And it's an interesting idea, but we could talk all day long about why the parallels don't work in reality. But I think it's very interesting that everything you've seen about what's happened to physical activity in the last century, why aren't we taking on the physical inactivity industry? Why is that? Everybody's sitting here with a device or 2 or 3 or 5 in front of them.
We don't want to give it up. That's why we like that.
Why don't we make cars illegal? If people couldn't drive cars wherever they wanted to go, they'd have to get there some other way, right? They'd have to either take the bus, or they'd have to ride their bike, or they'd have to walk. What's different about that than some of the things we're talking about for food? And I'm not saying that food gets a free pass, they don't. But at the same time, we're not applying an equal standard. If the way we're going to change the world is to punish the industries that create the environment that make us put us in this situation, then we're not being very egalitarian about it. I don't think that's the answer, but at the end of the day, I think it's a good question. Say, why don't we take on the physical activity industry? Who's suing Microsoft for making great software? Because it makes us want to sit there and play all day.
Computer addiction.
Well, and there's actually 2 pending lawsuits I've heard about from Mark Hamilton, class action lawsuits from employees suing their employer for making them sedentary, making them sit still for 8 hours a day. So maybe that's the route we get into change, is if somebody's suing somebody and it's hitting them in the wallet, then they start to look at changing something. But I think these are the kind of things that we like to think about here at the center because they're more complicated solutions, but at the end of the day, they're probably more encompassing of what reality really is.
So the takeaway here is, I think, when you ask the question, is it food or is it physical activity, you don't understand energy balance, or you would never ask that question. The answer is yes. I think if you want to be enormously physically active, doesn't matter what you eat. If you want to obsess over everything that goes into your mouth, you don't need to be physically active. Unless you're going to be at those extremes, most people are in the middle, where being moderately physically active and making some smart food choices is the way forward.
But if you're incredibly physically active, like an elite athlete, you need to be building muscle, you need protein, you can't just rely on sugar.
That's right. That's exactly right. And again, I should say that they typically eat more protein because they're burning so many calories. They're eating more of these nutrients. Probably, from a relative point of view, they're increasing protein even more. So they figure it out. And again, the athletes, they're eating a pretty good diet. And it starts with a high protein diet, but because they spend so many calories, they're eating way more fat and sugar than the normal population as well.